In 1995, a 38-year-old police officer disappeared during her night shift on the most dangerous streets of Phoenix. Kelly Martinez was a respected veteran, but that night, she simply vanished without a trace. For 8 years, her family lived in the agony of not knowing what had happened. Until 2003, when railroad workers made a discovery that would freeze anyone's blood: a leather collar with metal chains firmly tied to abandoned rails, along with a golden police badge and the remains of a blood-stained uniform. What they found was not just evidence of a brutal crime, but the beginning of a story of family betrayal that would destroy everyone involved. This is the story of how the search for justice can become a thirst for revenge that spares no one, not even one's own family. Make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more cases like this, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It was a cold November night in 1995 when Officer Kelly Martinez disappeared without a trace on the streets of Phoenix, Arizona. At 38 years old, Kelly was a respected veteran of the Phoenix Police Department, known for her unwavering dedication and courage on the most dangerous night patrols in the city. That night, like so many others, she had started her regular shift at 10 p.m., patrolling the most troubled sectors where gangs controlled the corners with iron fists. Kelly's last radio communication was at 11:47 p.m., reporting that everything was quiet in her assigned sector. Her voice sounded normal, with no signs of imminent danger. However, when the dispatcher tried to contact her again at 12:15 a.m. for a routine call, only silence answered. Her patrol car was found at dawn, abandoned in a dark alley in the industrial district, with the keys still in the ignition and her service weapon secured in its holster. The initial investigation revealed few clues. There were no signs of struggle in the vehicle, nor evidence of violence in the surrounding area. Security cameras in the zone had been vandalized days before, leaving a gap in electronic surveillance. Area residents, intimidated by the constant presence of gangs, refused to cooperate with investigators, closing doors and windows every time detectives knocked. Kelly's husband, Marcus Martinez, 42, worked as a mechanic at a local shop. During interrogations, Marcus seemed genuinely devastated by his wife's disappearance. He cried during interviews, describing Kelly as a strong and determined woman who loved her job despite the dangers. Their son Dylan, only 16 years old, was shattered by the loss of his mother, who had been his greatest source of support and inspiration. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months. The search extended throughout the state of Arizona, but Kelly Martinez had disappeared as if the earth had swallowed her whole. The case gradually grew cold, filed away among the thousands of unsolved cases that haunted police departments across the country. The years following Kelly Martinez's disappearance were a time of silent pain for the family and the Phoenix police community. Marcus Martinez tried to maintain normalcy for Dylan's sake, but Kelly's absence left an impossible void to fill. Young Dylan, who had been a promising student, began showing signs of anger and resentment toward the world that had taken his mother away. The Phoenix Police Department kept the case officially open, but the reality was that they had few leads to follow. Investigators had explored every possibility, from random kidnappings to personal vendettas related to arrests Kelly had made during her career. However, no line of investigation produced concrete results. During this period, Phoenix gangs continued expanding their territory and power. The area where Kelly had disappeared became even more dangerous, with frequent shootouts and escalating violence that kept residents terrorized. Police officers avoided patrolling alone in those areas, especially during night shifts. Marcus tried to rebuild his life, but the shadow of Kelly's disappearance haunted him constantly. He developed problems with alcohol and began isolating himself socially, rejecting support from friends and family. His relationship with Dylan deteriorated progressively as the teenager blamed his father for not having better protected his mother. Dylan, for his part, dropped out of school at 17 and began frequenting dangerous circles. His pain transformed into a thirst for revenge that consumed him day and night. He spent hours investigating on his own, trying to find any clue about what had really happened to his mother. His obsession led him to delve into the gang world, not as a member, but as a silent observer seeking answers. The police community never forgot Kelly Martinez. Every year on the anniversary of her disappearance, her colleagues organized a silent vigil, keeping alive the hope that someday the truth would come to light. However, as years passed, Even the most optimistic began to accept that Kelly had probably died. On March 15, 2003, 8 years after Kelly Martinez's disappearance, a group of railroad workers was performing maintenance work on an abandoned train line on the outskirts of Phoenix. The line had been out of service for more than a decade, and desert vegetation had begun to reclaim the rusted rails that stretched toward the horizon under Arizona's scorching sun. While workers removed brush and accumulated dirt, one of them noticed something strange between the rails. Initially, he thought it was trash discarded by vagrants, but as he got closer, his blood ran cold. Partially buried in the sand and covered by years of desert dust, there was a thick leather collar with metal chains, firmly secured to the rusted rails. The team supervisor, an experienced man who had worked on railroads for 3 decades, immediately recognized that something terrible had occurred at that place. Next to the collar, barely visible under layers of sediment, was a golden badge that gleamed dimly under the midday sun. With trembling hands, the supervisor carefully cleaned it, revealing the emblem of the Phoenix Police Department. A few meters away, partially covered by dry earth and remains of dead vegetation, workers found fragments of a female police uniform. The fabric, once dark blue, was now faded and stained by years of exposure to the elements. The uniform remains showed evident signs of violence, tears, dark stains that could have been blood, and deterioration that spoke of years of abandonment in the merciless desert. The supervisor immediately stopped work and contacted authorities. In less than an hour, the area was cordoned off, and forensic investigation teams had arrived at the scene. Veteran detectives who had worked on Kelly Martinez's original case were called back, some already retired, but willing to contribute to the renewed investigation. Initial analysis of the found objects confirmed what everyone feared. The badge belonged to Officer Kelly Martinez, and the uniform fragments matched Phoenix Police Department specifications from the mid-90s. The leather collar showed signs of having been used for restraint, and its position on the rails suggested an act of deliberate and calculated violence. The crime scene, preserved by Arizona's dry desert climate, began to tell a horrible story of kidnapping, torture, and murder that had remained hidden for 8 long years. The discovery on the abandoned rails immediately revitalized the Kelly Martinez case investigation. Veteran detective James Thompson, who had been one of the original investigators in 1995, was called back from retirement to lead the renewed team. At 58 years old, Thompson had seen cases that tormented him for decades, but Kelly Martinez's disappearance had been one of the most haunting. Forensic analysis of the objects found at the scene revealed disturbing details. The leather collar had been specially modified with welded metal chains, designed specifically to keep a person tied in a way that made escape impossible. Experts determined that the victim had been secured to the rails in a position that guaranteed any train passing through that line would result in instant death. Railroad records showed that the last train had passed through that line in February 1996, approximately 3 months after Kelly's disappearance. This information provided a crucial time window for the investigation. Kelly had been held captive for months before being taken to that remote location for execution. The forensic team also found evidence that the area had been used as a temporary campsite. Remains of campfires, rusted food cans, and other debris suggested that the perpetrators had used the zone as a base of operations. The location was ideal for criminal activities, completely isolated without surveillance, and far enough from civilization that screams wouldn't be heard. Thompson began re-examining all cases in which Kelly Martinez had been involved during her years of service. Her record showed a distinguished career, with multiple arrests of gang members and drug dealers. However, one case in particular began to stand out: the arrest of Miguel Santos, a high-ranking member of the Los Serpientes gang, in 1994. Santos had been arrested by Kelly in a raid that dismantled a drug trafficking operation valued at millions of dollars. The arrest had been clean and by the book, but Santos had sworn revenge against Kelly during his processing. He had been sentenced to 15 years in prison, but had powerful connections in the criminal world who could have acted on his behalf. Thompson's investigation revealed that Los Serpientes had a reputation for elaborate and cruel revenge against those who interfered with their operations. The gang had been responsible for several brutal murders in the 90s, including torture and execution of informants and rivals. The modus operandi found in Kelly's case matched the organization's known methods. As the investigation deepened, Detective Thompson decided to re-interrogate Marcus Martinez, Kelly's husband. 8 years had passed since the disappearance, and Thompson hoped that time had softened some defenses or revealed new details that Marcus might have forgotten or suppressed due to trauma. The interview took place at the police station on a Tuesday afternoon. Marcus, now 50 years old, showed evident signs of the alcoholism and depression that had characterized his life since Kelly's loss. His hands trembled slightly, and he avoided direct eye contact with Thompson. From the beginning, something in his behavior alerted the experienced detective. Thompson began with routine questions about Kelly's last days, covering the same territory that had been explored years earlier. However, this time he noticed minor inconsistencies in Marcus's account, small discrepancies that had previously gone unnoticed. When Thompson gently pressed about these details, Marcus became visibly nervous. The conversation took a crucial turn when Thompson mentioned Miguel Santos's name and the Los Serpientes gang. Marcus immediately stiffened, and an expression of panic crossed his face. Thompson, with decades of experience reading suspects' body language, immediately knew he had touched a crucial nerve. Under increasing pressure, Marcus began to break down emotionally. Between tears and sobs, he revealed that he had been keeping a terrible secret for 8 years. He admitted that he had been involved in illegal activities, specifically providing information about Kelly's patrol routes in exchange for money to support a gambling addiction he had kept hidden from his wife. Marcus confessed that he had accumulated massive gambling debts with bookmakers connected to Los Serpientes. When he couldn't pay, the gang offered him an alternative: provide them with information about Kelly's movements, specifically when and where she would be patrolling alone. Marcus, desperate and terrified, had agreed, never imagining that the information would be used to kidnap and murder his own wife. The revelation was devastating. Marcus had been unknowingly the architect of Kelly's death. His betrayal had provided Los Serpientes with the exact information they needed to set a perfect trap. The weight of this realization had been consuming Marcus for years, bringing him to the brink of suicide on multiple occasions. Thompson realized he had not only a murder case, but also an inside job that had been orchestrated by the victim's own husband, albeit under duress and without knowledge of the final consequences. Dylan Martinez, now 24 years old, had grown up in the shadow of his mother's disappearance. For years he had suspected that his father was hiding something important about the 1995 events, but had never been able to prove anything concrete. Thompson's revelation about Marcus's betrayal was like an emotional earthquake that shook the foundations of everything Dylan believed he knew about his family. When Thompson visited Dylan to inform him about his father's confession, the young man's reaction was explosive. Years of repressed pain, anger, and search for answers culminated in a moment of terrible clarity. Dylan finally understood why his mother had died, and knowing that his own father had been responsible, filled him with a rage that transcends description. Dylan confronted Marcus that same night in the family apartment they now shared in uncomfortable silence. The conversation was brutal and heartbreaking. Marcus, broken down by years of guilt and self-destruction, didn't try to defend himself or justify his actions. He simply sat in his favorite chair, crying while Dylan screamed at him, expressing years of pain and betrayal. During the following weeks, Dylan began developing a revenge plan that would consume his entire being. He wouldn't be satisfied with Marcus being prosecuted by the legal system. He wanted personal, visceral justice. But his thirst for revenge wasn't limited to his father. The Los Serpientes members who had physically executed Kelly would also pay for their crimes. Dylan used his connections from the criminal world that he had developed during his years of independent investigation. He had cultivated informants and contacts who provided him with detailed information about Los Serpientes' current structure. He discovered that Miguel Santos had been released from prison in 2001 and had returned to Phoenix, where he had rebuilt his position within the gang. Through his sources, Dylan identified the specific individuals who had participated in Kelly's kidnapping and murder. Besides Santos, there were 3 other gang members who had been directly involved: Carlos Mendoza, the enforcer who had supervised the torture, Roberto Vasquez, who had handled the kidnapping logistics, and Antonio Ruiz, the youngest member who had been responsible for keeping Kelly captive during the months of torture. Dylan spent months meticulously planning his revenge. It wouldn't be an impulsive explosion of violence, but a carefully orchestrated campaign that would eliminate all those responsible for his mother's death. including his own father. Dylan Martinez's plan was set in motion on an October night in 2003. His first target was his own father, Marcus, whose betrayal had made Kelly's murder possible. Dylan had decided that Marcus would die at home, in the same place where Kelly had lived her last moments of happiness before leaving for her fateful last patrol. Dylan waited until Marcus was deeply asleep, aided by the combination of alcohol and antidepressants he had been taking since the confession. Using skills he had learned during his years on the margins of the criminal world, Dylan administered a carefully calculated overdose that would cause Marcus to apparently die from an accidental combination of alcohol and medication. Marcus's death was ruled accidental by the coroner, who had no reason to suspect foul play. Dylan had been careful not to leave evidence, and his grief appeared genuine to investigators. In fact, his pain was real. He was mourning not only the loss of his father, but also the complete destruction of his family and his own descent into darkness. With Marcus eliminated, Dylan turned his attention to Los Serpientes. His intelligence network had provided him with detailed information about each target's habits and vulnerabilities. Antonio Ruiz, the youngest member of the group, would be next. Dylan had identified him as the weak link, the most likely to break under pressure if captured alive. Dylan stalked Ruiz for weeks, learning his daily routines and identifying the perfect opportunity for revenge. Ruiz worked as a mechanic at a garage on Phoenix's east side, a job he had gotten after being released from prison on drug charges unrelated to the Kelly Martinez case. Dylan managed to corner Ruiz alone at the garage after hours. The confrontation was brief but brutal. Dylan wasn't seeking information. He was seeking justice. Using a combination of violence and psychological torture, Dylan made sure that Ruiz understood exactly why he was dying. He told him about Kelly Martinez, about how she had been a good cop trying to clean up the streets, and about how Ruiz had participated in turning her last months alive into a living hell. Ruiz's body was found 2 days later by his employer. The scene had been staged to look like a robbery gone wrong, but experienced investigators began to notice patterns that suggested something more sophisticated. However, without obvious connections between Dylan and Ruiz, the investigation didn't immediately point toward Kelly Martinez's son. Dylan felt a terrible but empty satisfaction after Ruiz's death. One piece of his revenge plan had been completed, but the pain of losing his mother hadn't diminished. If anything, it had intensified, driving him further into darkness and obsession. Antonio Ruiz's death had sent ripples through Los Serpientes, but initially they didn't connect the incident with the old Kelly Martinez case. However, Dylan's next target, Carlos Mendoza, would be more challenging. Mendoza was the gang's primary enforcer, a man with extensive experience in violence and survival. He had spent years evading both rival gangs and law enforcement, developing instincts that made him extremely difficult to approach. Dylan realized he needed a different approach for Mendoza. Direct confrontation would be too dangerous, and Mendoza was too paranoid to be easily trapped. Instead, Dylan decided to use Mendoza's own reputation against him. Through his network of informants, Dylan spread rumors that Mendoza had been stealing from Los Serpientes, skimming money from drug deals, and planning to leave town. In the world of organized crime, accusations of theft and betrayal were extremely serious. Dylan knew that the gang's leadership would investigate these allegations and that Mendoza would be forced to prove his innocence. This internal conflict would create opportunities for Dylan to strike when Mendoza was distracted and vulnerable. The strategy worked perfectly. Los Serpientes began monitoring Mendoza's activities, creating additional pressure and paranoia. Mendoza, unaware of the source of rumors, began taking increasingly desperate measures to prove his loyalty. This desperation led him to take risks he normally would have avoided. Dylan struck during one of these desperate moments. Mendoza had agreed to handle a high-risk drug pickup alone, trying to demonstrate his continued value to the organization. Dylan had learned about the pickup through his sources and positioned himself to intercept Mendoza en route to the meeting. The confrontation occurred in a remote warehouse district, similar to the industrial area where Kelly's patrol car had been found 8 years earlier. Dylan had chosen the location deliberately, wanting Mendoza to die in the same type of environment where Kelly had been taken. The irony was not lost on Dylan. He was becoming the very thing he hated, using violence and terror to achieve his goals. Mendoza fought back fiercely, but Dylan had the advantage of surprise and preparation. The battle was longer and more brutal than Dylan had anticipated, leaving him injured but victorious. Before killing Mendoza, Dylan made sure he understood the connection to Kelly Martinez, explaining exactly how Mendoza's participation in her torture and murder had led to this moment of retribution. With Mendoza eliminated, Dylan had crossed a point of no return. He was no longer seeking justice. He was addicted to revenge. The violence had become its own reward, temporary relief from the pain that had been consuming him for years. 2 down, 2 to go. Roberto Vasquez and Miguel Santos remained on his list. Carlos Mendoza's elimination had finally attracted the attention of Los Serpientes leadership. 2 of their members dead within weeks of each other, both with connections to old operations, created a pattern that couldn't be ignored. Miguel Santos, now a senior figure in the organization, began to piece together the connection to the Kelly Martinez case. Santos remembered the threats that Dylan Martinez had made years earlier, when he was still a teenager, consumed with grief and anger. At the time, Santos had dismissed Dylan as just another broken kid who would eventually move on. Now, with 2 of his associates dead, Santos realized he had underestimated the depth of Dylan's commitment to revenge. Los Serpientes began hunting for Dylan, but he had become extremely skilled at avoiding detection. Years of operating in the shadows had taught him how to move through Phoenix without being seen, how to use the city's abandoned buildings and forgotten spaces to his advantage. He had become a ghost, visible only when he chose to strike. Roberto Vasquez, aware that he was likely the next target, went into hiding. Unlike Mendoza, Vasquez was more cerebral, the planner who had handled the logistics of Kelly's kidnapping. He understood that Dylan was not just seeking random violence, but specifically targeting those involved in his mother's death. This knowledge made him extremely cautious, but also provided Dylan with psychological leverage. Dylan began a campaign of psychological warfare against Vasquez, similar to what he had done with Mendoza, but more intense. He left reminders of Kelly Martinez at places Vasquez frequented, copies of her police academy graduation photo, newspaper clippings about her disappearance, even flowers like those that had been placed at memorial services. The message was clear. Dylan knew where Vasquez went, and he was closing in. The psychological pressure eventually broke Vasquez's resolve. Desperate and terrified, he reached out to Santos, demanding better protection or help leaving Phoenix permanently. This communication gave Dylan the opportunity he needed. By monitoring Los Serpientes' communications, Dylan learned about a meeting between Vasquez and Santos, scheduled for the following week. The meeting was set for a restaurant on the outskirts of Phoenix, chosen for its discreet location, and the fact that Santos had connections with the owner. Dylan spent days preparing for what would be his most dangerous operation yet. Unlike his previous targets, this time he would be facing 2 experienced criminals simultaneously, both of whom knew he was coming. Dylan's plan was audacious and potentially suicidal. He would confront both Vasquez and Santos together, accepting the risk of death if it meant completing his mission of revenge. The night before the planned attack, Dylan wrote a detailed letter explaining his actions, addressing it to Detective Thompson. In the letter, he confessed to the murders of his father and the Los Serpientes members, providing evidence and details that would help authorities understand the full scope of what had happened. The night of the final confrontation arrived like a desert storm, inevitable and devastating. Dylan Martinez, now 25 years old, had become something that his mother, Officer Kelly Martinez, would never have recognized. The search for justice had transformed him into an avenger, consumed by darkness, but determined to complete his mission regardless of the consequences. The restaurant on the outskirts of Phoenix was a perfect place for the last act of this tragedy. Dylan arrived early, positioning himself strategically to observe the arrival of Roberto Vasquez and Miguel Santos. When the 2 men entered the establishment, Dylan felt a mixture of satisfaction and terror that paralyzed him momentarily. These were the last names on his list, the final ones responsible for his mother's death. The confrontation was quick and brutal. Dylan had lost the element of surprise he had used in his previous attacks, but his desperation and determination made him a formidable opponent. Santos, the veteran criminal, tried to negotiate, offering money and power in exchange for his life. Vasquez, paralyzed by terror, could only plead for mercy. Dylan showed none. In his eyes, these men had tortured and murdered the most important person in his life. There was no amount of money or pleas that could change that fact. The revenge he had planned for years was finally completed in minutes of violence that shook the small restaurant. However, Dylan's victory was short-lived. Los Serpientes had more members than he had anticipated, and his personal war against the organization had awakened a massive response. As Dylan tried to escape from the scene, he was ambushed by reinforcements that Santos had called as a precaution. The shootout that followed was intense and deadly. Dylan Martinez died that night in the restaurant parking lot, surrounded by the bodies of those he had killed. His last thoughts were of his mother, Kelly, and the hope that she would finally find peace, knowing that her killers had paid for their crimes. Detective Thompson found Dylan's body along with the confessional letter he had written, finally providing all the answers the investigation had sought. The Martinez family tragedy came to an end with Dylan's death, but left a complex legacy of pain, revenge, and perverted justice. Kelly Martinez had been a dedicated officer who died for doing her job honestly. Her husband Marcus had been a weak man whose desperate decisions caused his wife's death. And Dylan had been a son who loved his mother so much that he destroyed himself seeking revenge. The case was officially closed, but the story continued to resonate in Phoenix as a reminder of how injustice can corrupt even the noblest intentions and how the pursuit of revenge can destroy not only the guilty, but also the innocent left behind. If you've made it this far and want to see more stories like this, I invite you to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any stories. Leave a like so we can keep sharing more stories like this. See you next time.